Folks around here call him by all kinds of names. Stranger, drifter, old man with the hat. But no one's ever heard him say his name out loud. Not once. Not 'cause he's secretive. Just, he don't remember. He lives out past the edge of town, in a crooked little cabin near the pines where the wind always sounds like it's trying to say something. And every year, the first night the snow falls, someone leaves a worn-out cowboy hat on his porch. Same hat, same spot, no footprints, no note, just that old hat waiting like it's got something to finish. And him, he'll sit there all night, harmonica in hand, looking up at the stars and asking real quiet, "What was my name again?" He lives alone in a shack made of half-remembered wood, the kind of place built more from habit than intention, slouched out near the tree line where the wind tangles in pine needles and the ground remembers every boot that ever crossed it. No electricity, just a fireplace that coughs more than it burns and an old AM radio that only picks up static and sermons. Every morning, he boils water for coffee in a dented tin kettle. No sugar, no milk, just black, bitter, and hot enough to make his fingers forget the cold. Sometimes he hums, just a few notes, slow and low, like he's trying to remember a song he once knew, but don't quite know if it ever had words. His days are quiet. He fixes fences that don't need fixing, chops wood he'll never burn, and writes little notes to himself on the back of receipts. Feed the mare. Check the gate. Stay awake today. He never signs them, just folds them up and puts them in a pocket of a coat that's seen more winters than conversations. Down at the general store, they call him Stranger. He shows up once every few weeks, buys the same 3 things: coffee grounds, matches, and beans. Doesn't speak unless someone speaks first. And even then, just a nod, a look, maybe a thanks. But folks don't press. Around here, everyone's running from something. Some just run quieter than others. What makes it strange is the way he always looks toward the north ridge when the wind picks up in the evening, like he's expecting someone. Or maybe just hoping the wind will bring back whatever he lost before his name slipped through the cracks. He used to ride with a name. Not a famous one, but known well enough along the old cattle trails between Red Elk and Devil's Hollow. Folks called him Jonah Cade. Fast hand, quiet heart. Didn't drink much, didn't talk more than he had to. But he had a laugh that rolled like thunder on open plains, and a way of looking at his daughter like the world had finally done something right. He had a wife, Annabelle, freckled cheeks, wild hair, and the stubbornness of a storm. She played harmonica better than he ever could. Used to play every night while the baby fell asleep in her arms. A little song she wrote called Rosie. Said it made the wind hush so the baby could dream louder. They had a small place back in Red Elk. Not much to look at, but filled with warm quilts, sun-faded curtains, and the kind of quiet only a happy house knows. And then came that night. The memory comes in flashes, like lightning without thunder. He remembers the sound of boots on wooden steps, the way the saloon door slammed like a warning too late. He was playing cards, just one round, just 10 minutes, he told her. One round too long. By the time the first shot cracked the silence, Jonah was on his feet. By the time he reached the street, it was already over. A rider with a red scarf vanished into the black. The house was burning. Not a roaring fire, just an ugly orange cough that swallowed the curtains and silenced the harmonica. He doesn't talk about what he found inside. Nobody does. The grave markers outside Red Elk are weathered now. Just 2 crosses, carved into driftwood. No names. Jonah couldn't bring himself to carve them, as if putting the names down would make the pain too real, too permanent. He never stayed to see if anyone asked. He left before dawn. No hat, no saddlebag, just the harmonica in his coat and a fire in his chest that never burned out, only went cold.
The weeks that followed were quiet, too quiet. Jonah rode south at first, sleeping under cottonwoods and counting stars instead of hours. He didn't speak, didn't stop, didn't shave, and he sure as hell didn't pray. Some nights he'd find himself sitting by a creek, holding the harmonica like it might still hum on its own. But it stayed silent, like it too had nothing left to say. He tossed it once, deep into the canyon, but by morning it was back in his saddlebag. He never told anyone how. That's the thing about grief out west. It don't ride in with a storm. It settles in your boots, your bones, your breath. He worked a few ranches under fake names. Tom, Lee, JT. He'd leave when folks started asking where he came from. Sometimes they'd say, "Ain't you that feller from Red Elk?" And he'd answer with the shrug that meant, "Don't know, don't care, don't ask again." The forgetting didn't happen all at once. It came like sand blown across tracks. Slow, sneaky, complete. First, he forgot the sound of her voice. Then the color of Rosie's ribbon. Then the reason he ever picked up a gun in the first place. By the 5th winter, he stopped writing his name on anything. Didn't need to. No one asked. No one called out to him across the prairie. He could walk through a whole town and not hear a single soul say his name. And one day, he heard it in a dream. Jonah. But it felt like someone else's name. A name he used to wear like an old coat that no longer fit. So, he went where names didn't matter. Built a shack where the map faded. And waited. Not for forgiveness. Not for answers. Just for something to come back. Each year, first snow, the hat would arrive. Same leather,
Same weathered brim, like time kept trying to nudge him, like someone, somewhere, was remembering what he'd tried so damn hard to forget. But the pain, it was safest when it stayed quiet. And that was the life he chose. A man without a name, too broken to look back, too stubborn to vanish completely. It was a Tuesday, cold enough to bite, quiet enough that even the trees seemed to be holding their breath. Jonah had just put another log on the fire when he heard it. 3 knocks. Not loud, not scared, just sure. He opened the door, and there he was, a boy, no older than 10, with a satchel slung across one shoulder and snow clinging to the brim of his hat like it had followed him from someplace far. The boy didn't shiver, didn't speak right away, just looked up at Jonah with eyes that reminded him of someone he couldn't place. "You Jonah?" the boy asked. Jonah's jaw tensed. He hadn't heard that name out loud in years, not even in his own mind. He opened his mouth to say no, but the word didn't come. The boy pulled out a folded paper from his coat. Not a letter, a drawing. Rough pencil lines, a tall man with a wide-brimmed hat holding the hand of a little girl. And underneath, written in shaky childish print, "My mama said this is the man who used to play music for her. Said he had a scar on his jaw, like yours." Jonah didn't answer. He just stepped aside and let the boy in. Didn't ask who his mama was. Didn't ask why he'd come. Some things don't need asking. The boy sat near the fire like he'd been there before, like the place remembered him. He looked around, quiet, then said, "Mama said, sometimes folks forget their name when their heart gets too loud." And Jonah, he didn't say a word, just stared at the drawing in his hand and wondered if maybe, just maybe, this was the reason he'd stayed alive this long. The boy stayed. Didn't ask. Didn't wait for permission. He just unpacked his satchel like it was the most natural thing in the world. 3 shirts, a slingshot, a handful of river stones, and a tiny harmonica with 1 dented reed. Jonah didn't send him away. Didn't ask for a name. They didn't speak much. But something about the silence felt easier now. Like the cabin had stretched its old bones and made room for one more story. They spent the first day patching a broken window. The boy was better with tools than he had any right to be. "Learn from Mama," he said, handing Jonah a nail like it was a gift. That night they ate soup and cornbread, and the boy asked if Jonah still played music. Jonah shook his head. "Forgot how," he said. The boy pulled out his tiny harmonica, blew a crooked little tune that stuttered and squeaked, but still sounded like hope trying to walk on a limp. Jonah listened, not with his ears, with something deeper. For the first time in a long while, he slept the whole night. The days rolled on. They built a new gate for the chicken coop, chopped wood, fed the mare. The boy talked to the animals like they were old friends, named the red hand Pickles and the mule Sheriff, even though she hadn't moved faster than a turtle in 5 years. Sometimes the boy would sit on the porch and sketch. Clouds, birds, Jonah's boots. Once he drew the fire and labeled it warmth not danger. Jonah didn't say anything, but he left that picture on the mantel. One night, while the wind howled like something lost, Jonah reached for the harmonica. His hands trembled, but he played 3 clear notes. The boy didn't clap, didn't say good job. He just smiled and whispered, "Told you it remembers." And somehow, Jonah did too. It was just after supper. Beans and cornbread again, though neither of them seemed to mind. The fire popped in the stove, casting lazy shadows that swayed across the floorboards like memories dancing without asking permission. The boy sat cross-legged by the hearth, harmonica in hand, blowing soft, uncertain notes, like he was making up a song as he went. Jonah sat in his usual chair, boots unlaced, cup of lukewarm coffee in hand that he hadn't taken a sip of in 20 minutes. He watched the boy, watched the way his brows furrowed when a note came out wrong, the way he tried again anyway. Then, a melody. Simple, soft. 3 notes, then 4, repeating like a lullaby learned long ago. It wasn't exact, not yet, but something about the rhythm, the way it paused between breaths, it stirred something deep in Jonah's chest, like an ache he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what it used to mean. He didn't say a word, didn't move, just sat there, hands slowly tightening round the coffee mug as the boy kept playing, over and over. The same lilting pattern, barely more than a hum. But to Jonah, it wasn't just music. It was a voice. It was her voice, Annabelle's, singing Rosie to sleep on nights when the roof rattled and the world outside their window felt too big to bear. She always sang that same song. Just a few lines. Didn't matter if it had words. Rosie never needed them. The harmonica was just her way of pushing back the dark. He'd forgotten that. Had told himself he didn't remember. Had built a whole damn life on not remembering. But memory doesn't die. It waits. Buried in the spaces between notes, in smells, in light fallen just so. And now, like floodwater behind a thin wall, it came pouring in. He was younger, thinner. Laughter in his voice. Annabelle in the garden cursing the mules as swearing she'd trade 'em for chickens if they didn't listen. Rosie, 3 years old, running barefoot through grass with hair wild as prairie fire. There was music in that life. Not the kind you play, but the kind that just happens. In the way a table creaks under supper. In the sound of boots kicked off tired. In a fire crackling while someone you love breathes easy beside you. And then, gunfire. Smoke, the sound of silence that followed, the scream caught in his chest as he knelt in the ashes and picked up a harmonica half melted by heat, but still cold in his hand. He'd made himself forget, because to remember meant facing what he'd lost and what he couldn't fix. But now, a boy he never met was sitting in his home, was pulling all of it back with nothing but breath and brass. Jonah opened his eyes. The boy had stopped playing. He was just looking at him, not scared, not confused, just waiting. Jonah couldn't speak. He stood slowly. His knees cracked like dry twigs, but he walked to the mantel and picked up the old harmonica he hadn't touched in years. He held it next to the boys. Same make, same dent, like it was calling out to its twin. "Where'd you learn that song?" Jonah finally asked. The boy blinked. "Mama hummed it. Said it came from someone she used to love." "Did she tell you his name?" The boy nodded. "She said his name was Jonah, but he didn't remember it no more." And there it was. Jonah felt something break loose in his chest. Not pain, not relief, grief maybe, but shaped like peace. He sat down, held the harmonica tight, and whispered, half to the fire, half to himself, "My name was Jonah. I think it still is."
The fire had burned down low, only embers now, soft and red like memories, still too warm to touch. Jonah sat still for a long while, harmonica resting on his knee. The boy didn't push, just watched him, quiet as a field before a storm. Then Jonah spoke. "She used to play that song every night, even when Rosie had already fallen asleep. Said it kept the bad dreams from circling back." His voice sounded unfamiliar to his own ears. Not rough like usual, but worn, like a road traveled too many times. Her name was Annabelle. Hair like wildfire, smile like rain in July. She could look at me and tell if I was lying, even before I knew I was. The boy leaned forward, chin in his hands, like the story was the only thing keeping the walls from closing in. Jonah stared into the fire. Rosie, she was just a little thing. Always barefoot, always singing nonsense songs and trying to saddle the mule with flower crowns. He laughed once. It came out dry, cracked at the edges, but real. They died. Both of them. Fire, gunshot. I don't know which came first, and I still don't want to. The boy didn't say anything, didn't flinch, didn't look away. Jonah rubbed a hand over his face, then stared at the palm like it might hold answers. After that, I stopped being a man, just turned into smoke, drifting from town to town. It didn't matter what folks called me. I wasn't there anyhow. Silence. The kind that wraps around you, not to suffocate, but to hold. Then the boy said, quiet but clear, "My mama said the man who played that song wasn't a ghost. He was just hiding. And ghosts don't hide, they haunt." Jonah looked at him. Really looked. And for a second, in the set of his jaw, in the tilt of his brow, he saw something achingly familiar. "What's your name, boy?" "Cole." "And your mama?" "She didn't tell me everything, just that the man who gave her the song had a scar on his jaw and eyes full of thunder." Jonah reached up, traced the scar without thinking. It had always been there, a reminder, a curse. Now, maybe a key. The next morning, the frost clung heavy to the windows. The kind that whispers, "Today ain't just another day." Jonah rose before the sun, made coffee, left 2 mugs out,
Cole didn't ask where they were going. He just pulled on his coat and followed. They rode in silence. The old mule, Sheriff groaning with each step, Jonah on foot, one hand resting on the reins like he was guiding memory itself. They passed the river, the cottonwoods, the place where the fence still leaned after 20 winters. Then the hill came into view. Not much of a hill, just a gentle rise covered in dry grass and wind. But Jonah's boots slowed when the top came close, like his body knew what his mouth still refused to say. There were 2 wooden crosses, half swallowed by time. No names, just weathered grain and splinters where letters might have been. Jonah knelt, not to pray, but to remember. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. It was a ribbon. Frayed, faded pink, still smelled faintly of smoke and lilac. He placed it at the base of one cross. Then the harmonica. His, not the boy's. He set it beside the other. Didn't cry, didn't speak, just stayed there. Hat off, heart bare. Cole stood behind him, hands jammed into his pockets. He didn't try to interrupt. Then softly, "She gave that ribbon to me, said it used to belong to someone strong." Jonah looked up. "You met her?" he asked. Cole nodded. "Mama didn't say much, but when I was little, she'd hold that ribbon to her cheek like it was her whole world." A pause. "She used to cry when she played Rosie. Said she couldn't help it." Jonah's voice came slow. She got out?" Cole nodded again. "Barely. Doctors said she might not make it, but she did. And she kept this ribbon. Said it reminded her of the man who wasn't brave enough to stay, but loved her all the same." Jonah's jaw clenched. Not out of anger, not regret, just wait. He stood, dusted off his knees, looked at the crosses like they'd finally given him permission to breathe, then turned to Cole. "You still got that drawing?" Cole pulled it from his satchel. Wrinkled, edges curled, but still there. A tall man, a little girl, and the words, "The man who played music for Mama." Jonah took it, held it like a photograph from a life he never thought he'd see again. "Let's go home, son." And for the first time, the word home didn't sound like punishment. They got back just before dark. The wind had picked up, not sharp, but restless, like it had stories it couldn't hold in anymore. Jonah lit the fire. Cole fed Sheriff a few apples gone soft. Neither of them said much. The kind of silence they shared now wasn't heavy. It was full, like the space between waves when the tide knows it'll return. That night,
Jonah pulled a box from beneath the floorboards, dusty, untouched, wrapped in a red checkered shirt he hadn't worn since the day he buried his name. He opened it slowly. Inside, a rusted belt buckle with the letter J. A photograph, blurred at the edges, Annabelle holding Rosie on the porch swing. A letter, never sent, scrawled in clumsy ink. If I don't come back, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I never stopped loving her. And tell the little one I tried. Jonah sat at the table, laid everything out like pieces of a life he'd dropped on the trail. Cole came over, studied each item, then pointed to the photo. "That's her," he said, as if it had ever been in doubt. Jonah's hands trembled as he ran his fingers over the paper. Annabelle's smile hadn't changed, not even in memory. He didn't cry, but his shoulders shook, like the body weeps when the soul's too tired. Later, just before bed, Cole turned to him. "So, what do I call you now?" Jonah raised an eyebrow, a hint of mischief in his eyes, the kind that hadn't been seen since before the fire. "You already been calling me old man. Ain't that enough?" Cole grinned, but didn't laugh. He reached into his coat, pulled out something small, a wooden tag, worn smooth. On it, carved with a child's unsteady hand, Dad. Jonah froze. It wasn't the word, it was the way he said it, like he'd been holding it in for years he couldn't count. Jonah swallowed, then took the tag in his hand, held it like it might disappear if he blinked too hard, and whispered, "I ain't sure I deserve that." Cole shrugged. "Don't matter. Mama said names ain't something you earn. Sometimes they're just waiting for you to come back." Outside, snow had started to fall again. But inside, two people sat beside a fire, and the silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was full of the things they didn't need to say. And somewhere, far off, the wind carried a tune that sounded an awful lot like Rosie. The days got longer. Spring whispered through the trees like a secret coming back to life. Jonah started shaving again. Not every day. He still wasn't that kind of man, but enough to recognize himself in the mirror. He fixed the porch swing, hung it just like the old one. Didn't say why, didn't need to. Cole sat on it most evenings, sketching trees, birds, and sometimes people. The town folks started seeing Jonah again. Not the ghost of him that came in for salt and disappeared, but the real man. He even tipped his hat once or twice. When the sheriff passed him on the trail one morning, he said, "Heard tell your boy's a good shot with a slingshot." Jonah smiled, not wide, but deep. "Taught me everything I know," he said. They rebuilt the chicken coop proper, replanted the garden, named a new calf Rosie, and laughed every time she kicked the fence like she was in charge. Jonah taught Cole how to play cards, real cards, told him which ranches to avoid, which watering holes served the best chili, and why you should never bet against a woman wearing red gloves. They didn't talk much about the past anymore, not because it hurt, but because it finally had a place to rest. One evening, Cole played the harmonica by the fire.
The tune was different now, still gentle, but with a rhythm that sounded like breathing. Jonah joined in, low, careful notes. Two voices, not in harmony, but not alone either. Later that night, Cole asked, "What if I forget you someday?" Jonah took a long breath, tossed another log on the fire. The sparks rose like stars. "Then I'll play the song, and you'll remember not the name, but the feeling." Cole nodded, then whispered, "I think Mama'd be proud." Jonah looked at the boy, his boy, and for the first time in his long, wandering life, he said with certainty, "I know she is." They say the West is full of ghosts, not the kind that rattle chains, but the kind that sit beside you when the fire burns low and the world's gone quiet. Jonah used to be one, a shadow with no name, drifting through time like he was afraid to leave footprints. But now, he's just a man with a porch swing, a mule named Sheriff, and a boy who calls him Dad. He still forgets sometimes, still wakes up thinking he's lost something. But then he hears a soft tune on the wind, a few familiar notes, and he remembers that names can be forgotten, but love, real love, always finds its way home. So if you're still awake, watching the fire fade or listening to the wind wrap itself around your window, I hope this story kept you warm. And if you're carrying a name that don't feel like yours tonight, that's all right. Sometimes it takes time to remember who we are. So close your eyes, darling. Let the stars do the watching now. And from way out here, on this quiet edge of the frontier, Jonah and I wish you a gentle night and a peaceful sleep. We'll see you next time, right here, where the stories never end, they just settle like dust. Good night, cowboy.